Michael, do you want to start recording? Oh, okay, you started.
Welcome everyone to this joint seminar. It's a joint seminar for the History and Philosophy of the Social Sciences Network and for the Economics Department. And my pleasure to introduce Manuela Mosca, who's a very eminent historian of economics, a person who is an expert in particularly Italian thinking in economics, particularly the marginalist phase, which is what she's going to talk about today on monopoly power and competition from the perspective of the Italian marginalists. She's an expert on Antonio Da Viti De Marco, on Pareto, Barone, Pantaleone. I admire her work. I had the good fortune to read this book not that long ago, and you will learn something from it too, and had the great pleasure of learning many new things, which is what the research community celebrates in scholars like Manuela. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Manuela, and we're in your hands. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I thank you for the invitation. So I share the screen and start with my presentation. I'm already in troubles. Here it is. Here it is. Then I want to put this one somewhere else, and then let me know if you see my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yeah, it's perfect, Manuela.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so let's start. My first question. I really don't know where to put the. Okay, here better. Okay. So my first question was if it was worthwhile to study monopoly power, and I tried to find if there was already a history of monopoly power. But in particular, my question was, how have economists of the past explained monopoly power? So it was not exactly on monopoly power, but on the sources of monopoly power. So my question was, what are the sources of monopoly power according to the economists of the past? And then I decided to study the sources of monopoly power in the Italian marginalist. The name has already been said by Michael: Vilfredo Pareto, Maffeo Pantaleoni, Antonio De Viti De Marco, and Enrico Barone. So in this presentation, I decided to go into details of the first part of my research. So the aims of my research were to contribute to the reconstruction from a historical perspective of the theory of the sources of monopoly power, and of course, inevitably, its relation with the concept of competition. The second aim was to demonstrate that the Italian marginalists are a specific intellectual tradition, a close-knit group. You will see from my presentation how interrelated they were, and how knowledge was a choral process for them. So I would like to transmit to the literature that there is an Italian group that can be called the Italian marginalist. There is a specific tradition, Italian tradition. Then, of course, I will base my research on the theory, first of all, but not only on the theory that was rich and innovative, not only, but the theory was their main concern, even if they wanted to use this theory to be applied to reality. So I not only will pay attention to the theory, to the theoretical innovations, but I reconstruct the context in which their theories were applied, because, as I said, they were very interested in applying their theories. So in this presentation, as I said, I will enter into details in the motivation of this research on the sources of monopoly power in the history of economic thought. Then I will I will illustrate the theory of competition that I found in these 4 Italian marginalists. And after that, I will focus on their ideas on monopoly power. I will skip a part because I don't think I will have time. And then I think the most important part is how they applied and how they wanted to influence reality. The last part will be on their concept of the state and their idea of economic policy. So let's start where I started. I started with a careful research in the secondary literature on the sources of monopoly power. And so I had to decide in which field to look for this secondary literature at the beginning of my research. So as monopoly power is a characteristic of non-competitive markets, I examined 4 possible fields of inquiry in order to find if there was already a theory of the sources of monopoly power and to check if there were good suggestions in this direction. So first of all, I studied the historiography on the formal models of profit maximization in non-competitive markets. That's, of course, the first literature that came to my mind because Cournot, there is, of course, the model of duopoly, Jules Dupuy, that was the subject, the topic of my PhD dissertation, had some ideas on the sources of monopoly power. And this list of names is the list of names that I have found in the history of the formal models of profit maximization in non-competitive markets. However, most of them, the large majority of them, do not explain why firms have monopoly power. They are focused on the problem of how to maximize profits in non-competitive markets. And they do not explain the reason why there are few firms in a market. This is the list of the secondary literature that I examined in this part of my research. So I didn't find a history of the sources of monopoly power in this historiography. Then I thought that antitrust the literature on antitrust in historical perspective could be a good base for my research, but actually it was not, because antitrust is focused on the sources of monopoly power that are deriving from anti-competitive practice. So there was not a general analysis on the sources of monopoly power. Here too, I put the secondary literature, because this part is only based on historiography. It's the preliminary part of my research, only based on secondary literature, in order to find if it was worthwhile to start this research. Then I decided to look to the historiography on competition theories in historical perspective, in order to get some indirect information on monopoly power. I have to specify that I was interested in non-legal, non-institutional sources of monopoly power, because there was no problem with legal institutions. They come from the state. It's not problematic at all. So I was interested in non-legal sources. And as everybody knows, before 1930s, competition was seen as a process, a dynamic activity, and it was not seen as antithetical to monopoly. Monopoly was part of the strategy to compete. So to compete was the idea was to start a race with the other people. It was not a concept that we know now as perfect competition, of course. So these are the names that came out from the secondary literature in the classical period and in the neoclassical period. And here you have a long list because differently from the monopoly power, the competition theory was studied. There is a lot of secondary literature on competition theories in historical perspective. And here we have also the famous article of Mary Morgan, who is with us today. What I've got from this secondary literature is that the economists of the past dealing with competition could single out some sources of monopoly power. And I can divide them between exogenous obstacle of competition and endogenous obstacle. The exogenous obstacle to competition, I list them here, are imperfect factor mobility, custom, and a certain type of technology. And also endogenous. Endogenous means that the firm that they use some strategies to compete. So endogenous means they use some strategies. They adopt some strategic behavior to compete. And here there is also the list that comes out from the secondary literature: limited knowledge, agreements, product differentiation. And in all this literature, the number of firms is controversial. So somebody thinks that the number of firms in a market is important for monopoly power, and other thinks that it doesn't matter. In this literature, the focus is not on monopoly power, it is on competition, but I found some interesting material for my research. And then the last one, the last secondary literature that I examined is the historiography on industrial organization. And in this literature, I found that my search had a name, had a modern name. So the sources of monopoly power coincides, are the barriers to entry. Are the barrier to entry. And so I said, maybe there is a history on the concept of barriers to entry. And I found that the history of barriers to entry started with Joe Bain in 1956. And there is not historical literature focused on barriers to entry before Bain. So Bain was the one who invented the concept of, not the concept, the definition of barriers to entry. So the history always starts from Bain, like there was nothing before. So I tried to, and here is also the historiography on industrial organization that I examined in order to find something. But then I asked myself, is there something written already about the sources of monopoly power before the definition of entry barriers? And so I looked in the literature focused on the history of the discipline, on the history of industrial organization. And the origin of this industrial organization starts from the 30s. So I have found something indirectly from the 30s on the impediments to entry. However, the problem of the relation between free entry and market power was not fully focused on. And then I asked myself, how about before the 30s? In the 30s, the industrial organization as a discipline starts, but is there something before the 30s? And here too, I could find just a little of secondary literature on the prehistory of the discipline. And I found some suggestions. These are the names of the economists of the past, in which I have found some suggestions before the 30s. And here is the list of the causes of the sources of monopoly power that can be found in these names. The literature is not systematic at all, but there are encouraging suggestions. So this slide is just to sum up the four fields in which I tried to find a history of the sources of monopoly power. And then I realized that there is a gap in the literature before Bain and even before the birth of industrial organization, but there are useful suggestions. So I thought it was worthwhile to look. There were good reasons to research for further. Then I asked myself where to search. And then I found answers again from the historiography on competition and industrial organization. The secondary literature on competition and industrial organization says that the classical economists were not worried for monopoly power. In the world where they lived, they were not worried for obstacle to competition that were not legal. They were focused on the institutional sources of monopoly power, the state and the law and this kind of obstacles. And apart from this, they were convinced that monopoly power was always under the threat from potential competition. So it is impossible to find there a detailed analysis on the sources of monopoly power, while there was a lot in the marginalist period. They gave many contributions on monopoly power, and I think it was for two reasons. One was the change in reality, because they faced a situation in which they realized that market power was a phenomenon of long run, not short run. So differently from the classical economists, they realized that market power could last. So they asked themselves, why there are some industries in which market power lasts for so long. And also because little by little in those years started to emerge the notion of I would say the static competition. Perfect competition comes later, but so this idea of competition as equilibrium starts exactly in these years. So through these lenses, you don't see anymore strategic behavior as a competitive behavior, but you start seeing strategic behavior as a monopolistic behavior. So you have the category of monopoly power more, you see through the lenses of this new concept of static competition. So the first one is a change in reality, and the second one is the change in theory in the eyes of the economists who looked at the problem of monopoly. Then I tried to find if it could be worthwhile to study the Italian marginalists, and actually I found a good reason to go on with this search, because maybe it is known, but Schumpeter says that in this period, in these years, Italian economists were second to none. So it is a golden age for the Italian economic thought. I found many contributions on the subject. And then another encouraging sign was the filiation of ideas. Sraffa, who is the father of imperfect competition, is Italian. Silos Labini and Modigliani, who founded the new theory of oligopoly, are Italians. And also the history of the U-shaped cost curves as an important part in Italy. So I thought that these filiations of idea could be interesting to inquire. And then I focused on the four most important Italian marginalists of the period. Again, I found hints from the secondary literature. When I say good hints, I mean that these four names, one or more of these four names are quoted, mentioned, cited in the secondary literature on competition and industrial organization. And the other reason is that they were cosmopolitans, so they were very interconnected with the rest of the world, and their books were translated. They were very well known abroad, not outside Italy. And also for the reason that I said at the beginning, they had very deep personal ties, intellectual ties and political ties. So I wanted to show that this is a group, a tradition, a school. So these are the four, the Fab Four. Vilfredo Pareto, you can read here the reason why they are famous. I don't need to read the black part of the slide. I only want you to notice the date of birth. So Pantaleoni, De Viti De Marco, and Enrico Barone, they were almost the same age. Okay, Pareto was 10 years older. And give a look also to the date of death. In 23, 24, and 24, three of them, not the same three, died. And only De Viti De Marco survived, even if in isolation, because there was the fascist regime and it was anti-fascist. So there is a period of 40 years of overlap of their scientific career, in which the four lived together from the 1880 to the 1920, the beginning of the 1920s. They were in contact, very much in contact with one another. So let's start with the universal force of competition. Before telling you their idea on competition, I would like to show that they dealt with methodological issues in general. And in this methodological part of their research, they distinguished between statics and dynamics. Barone in 1894, he wrote an article on the treatment of dynamic issues, and in which he says that he calls dynamics the movement towards the final equilibrium. And even if he was a general equilibrium scholar, he uses partial analysis for the adjustment. Pareto didn't like this part of Barone methodology, but Barone tried to reconcile Marshall with Pareto using partial analysis exactly for describing the dynamics of the adjustment. So he uses the word provisional equilibrium, approximate equilibrium, and he says the oscillation never converge because there are new shocks that arise. Pareto also in the Kur and in the manual, he distinguished between statics and dynamics, two kinds of dynamics. The dynamics seen as a successive equilibrium, like the steps of a man coming down from the top of a hill, steps, that's a kind of dynamic. And another kind of dynamics is the continuous movement down the hill. These are the three kinds of way to study reality in economics, in economic theory. But he says that this third kind of dynamics is impossible to deal with in a rigorous sense. And also Pantaleoni in 1909 writes the alcuni fenomeni, means about some phenomena of economic dynamics, and he distinguished between the dynamics of the first type, and it is a sort of exam analysis of the stability of the equilibrium. So if there is a shock, does the system go back to the previous equilibrium or to another equilibrium? And that's the first type. The second type, the dynamics of the second type, is a situation in which after a shock, the economy does not converge anymore to any equilibrium, because in the meanwhile, there is a structural change of the system. This is just methodology. Then I wanted to show that they used the concept of statics and dynamics applied to competition. So if I use static and dynamic competition, it is because they used static and dynamic in their method. So let's start with static competition. They start with static competition, and they describe the condition for a competitive equilibrium. Perfectly is a word that was not used, it was used, but not as we do today. I want to remind that in this case, competitive equilibrium means that there is no market power. So competition is antithetical to market power, to monopoly power. And here there is a quotation from Pantaleoni that actually, to describe the condition for a competitive equilibrium, actually he describes all the conditions that we still think today that has to be accomplished in order to have a competitive equilibrium. So the competition can be felt instantly. So there is an instantaneous adjustment, both between industry, which presupposes knowledge of the profit. So there is information has to be known. And then the possibility of transferring capital from one to another, so free entry and exit. And also the industry, many firms in the same activity. So the product homogeneity I see in this sentence. And then there are the first attempts to formalize the story. Barone identifies perfect competition many times. He writes this statement that perfect competition means the achievement of two outcomes. The cost of production equals the price, and the average costs of production are at the minimum. So this is modern microeconomics, absolutely. And then here there is a description of competition in this sense as price taking. There is the mathematic expression of Pareto, no, to differentiate keeping prices constant. And in a letter to Pierre Bouvin, he says it is possible to avoid the word competition. Every time you find the word competition, you have to read, suppose that every individual accept a given price. And it is impossible for him to modify it. So this is the idea, the modern idea of competition as price-taking behavior. But they also describe the competition in dynamic terms. And there are three situations that I distinguished between in which they describe this dynamic of competition. The first one is a slow adjustment, as we have seen with Barone. So the transition toward competitive equilibrium is not instantaneous, and in that period, in the transition period, individuals have market power. The reasons for Barone are imperfect information, trial and error. Pareto says that the adjustment is a difficult process due to errors that the firms make in forecast and adapt. And maybe you know the dog curves, no? The pursuit curves are the curves that describe the behavior of a dog that is running toward an animal, a deer maybe, that is running in straight line, and it tries to reach it, so it makes a curve to reach the animal that is so. And this describes the behavior of the entrepreneurs who don't know at the beginning where they have to go, so they adjust their behavior little by little. For all of them, imperfect factor mobility is a reason for the fact that the adjustment is slow. The second reason for the second description of dynamic competition is due to the presence of innovators and imitators, in a sort of pre-Schumpeterian idea of competition. And here monopoly power is created by the innovators and is eliminated by imitators. Here is a quotation of Pareto, is a famous quotation of Pareto in which the entrepreneurs are at the top of a hill, and this hill is attacked by competitors. Also Pantaleoni believes very much in this kind of dynamic competition. He speaks of a volcanic eruption of an invention somewhere, and then when there is the propagation of this invention, another eruption comes in another place, and it is like a sea in ferment, boiling for this eruption of innovations. And here also Barone says competition consists above all of the substitution of entrepreneurs with lower cost, so innovative, for those that produce with higher cost. And then the third case in which they saw the dynamic of competition was the disequilibrium analysis. So there is not even an idea of equilibrium here, but monopoly power is essentially a part of the competition process. So here we find Pantaleoni, who says that competition is an aspect of the struggle for survival, a race where the starting position and the destination continually change. Very frequent is the concept of social selection in Pantaleoni to explain a kind of competition that recall Herbert Spencer. Pantaleoni was very much influenced by Spencer. De Vitti De Marco, it's interesting that uses this description of the competitive process in his political writings more than in his economic works. And we find also Barone that use the word a selection, a war, strategies when he wants to speak of the dynamic of competition. So my final consideration on what they thought competition is. I stress in my research the fact that they felt to be in continuity with the classical conception of dynamic competition. They themselves wanted to be in continuity with the classical. But to give rigor to the classical theories, they used mathematics. So they wanted to be in continuity with the classical conception of competition. At the same time, they wanted to give rigor to those theories and to use mathematics. So to use mathematics, they initially concentrated on the static competitive equilibrium with the idea of extending this translation into mathematical terms also to the dynamic part. But then they realized that they couldn't mathematize also dynamic competition. So much so that some of them gave up with economics. We know that at a certain point Pareto gave up, and also Pantaleoni turned a little bit toward sociology more than economics. So my opinion after this part of the research was that from the classical to the marginalist, there was a revolution in method, but not in content. So there is not a discontinuity in the search for a dynamic vision of competition between classical and the early neoclassical, so the marginalists. Then I started, and this is about monopoly power now, not competition anymore. This is the third part. Let me see what time. Yes. First of all, I've seen that the issue of monopoly power was very much discussed in Italy. There were works on network, public utilities, trust, cartels. So there was an Italian literature on this. It's not only a topic dealt with in the US or in Germany. In Italy, there was also a lot of discussion. Maybe they discussed what happened in the US or what happened in Germany, but also what happened in Italy. They were perfectly aware of the fact that between competition and monopoly, there was a lot of different degrees of market structure. And Pantaleoni compares the different market structure to the colors of the spectrum. Pantaleoni wrote an article on syndicates and associations, specifically devoted to the aggregation of firms. Pareto, in a letter to Cabbiati, wrote the theory of free competition is only one part of the theory of poor economics. So I want to show how aware they were of the fact that there are a lot of market structure between competition and monopoly. We all know, but economists, they think they invented now or recently the fact that there were different market structure between competition and monopoly. And also Barone wrote an article on monopolies and syndicates in 1909. So two of them were very interested, but all of them. Of course, they knew the models. They knew Cournot, Dupuy, Auspitz and Lieben. They knew, they quote them. But in looking at their contribution, my focus is on the sources of monopoly power, so barriers to entry in modern terms. Let's divide the contribution in two categories: the structural barriers and the strategic barriers that they could detect. So let's start with the structural barriers. I mean all the causes blocking entry due to structural condition. And one of the structural conditions is inelastic input supply. So if an input is in a given quantity, if somebody has a unique resource, there is a problem of monopoly power, of course. Pantaleoni uses also the category of the concept of non-competing groups that derive from Cairns, but he extended the meaning not only to the labor market for which it was invented, but to all the market, all the input markets with a closed entry. However, Pantaleoni was not worried of this kind of barriers because he insists that monopolistic equilibrium is pregnant of dynamism. So he doesn't believe that it will last, and he says that the only deserved market power is due to superior personal skills. The second reason for the structural barriers are a very interesting analysis of cost structures. So of the relation between costs and the number of firms in the industry. I realized that they were perfectly aware of the concept of that now today we call a minimum efficient scale. Here I quote them to show the relation that exists between this concept of minimum efficient scale and the idea of market power. So they knew that firms looked for expanded in order to find their minimum efficient scale dimension. So the expansion of enterprise stop at the minimum efficient scale. And Pantaleoni is very often mentioned the fact that the costs determine the size, the efficient size of the firm. He even says the typical size or even the optimum size. And in this way, he justifies the vertical integration of firms, even if they become a huge economic complex. He says that the reason is an economic reason, because they are looking for their minimum efficient scale. So they have to be huge because it's not efficient if they stop before. And Barone gave a very important contribution to the to describe, unfortunately not to represent graphically, but he described the U-shaped average cost curve. And he says that competition tends to oblige entrepreneurs to remain within the limits of decreasing costs. So at the maximum to the point of the minimum efficient scale. And the second case of structural barriers due to cost structure, to the cost of a firm, is natural monopoly. Natural monopoly is recognized by De Vitti De Marco, who studies the economies of scale in the case of a telephone industry. And he also recognized for the first time, as far as I know, the network externality effect of the telephone industry. So the fact that everybody has to belong to the same company in order to speak to one another by telephone. Yes, here there is a quotation by Pareto, who describes a case of natural monopoly. So the cost per unit of output decreases as output increases. And he believes that there are always limits. And also Pantaleoni recognized, even if they didn't believe that natural monopoly could be forever. He were confident that competition could still work. The inverse relation also between the degree of monopoly power and the demand elasticity, not called this way, but they were aware of the relation between monopoly power and customers' loyalty, habits, substitute goods, and so on. And let's go to the final part of their analysis on entry barriers. And I will illustrate you quickly their idea of strategic barrier. So intentionally adopted by the incumbent firm to set to preserve their monopoly power. Here, both Pareto and Barone introduced the concept of parasitic competition. What is that? It is a situation in which inefficient firms are protected by a cartel, even if the industry is as a production that is more than the production given by the minimum efficient size. So there are too many. They are too small and too many. So they wanted to more integration. They wanted big stores instead of lots of small inefficient shops. Yes, as you see, the four were against this sort of pulverization of firms, and they wanted to merge them in a bigger firm. And then the last one is the analysis of oligopoly. Oligopoly is a situation in which there are few large firms, and they behave strategically in order to acquire or maintain their market power. For all of them, collusion is easier in concentrated industries. Here there is a quotation by Pantaleoni, who was in conflict with a controversy with Charles Gide on cooperatives. And Pantaleoni says, even if they are ideologically against, also cooperative are like the other industries, so they have to refuse a potential entrant if they have already reached the minimum efficient scale. Here is a quotation in which you see how aware they were of the fact that there are not huge, but big business that struggle against other groups. Pantaleoni deals with cartel, trusts, mergers, and every kind of agreement, and they justify if these agreements are for reaching efficiency. And he is not worried. Pareto has a different attitude. Initially is in favor of the spontaneous formation of combination with the conviction that it will not last. But then little by little, he started to think that this big aggregation of firms, they are good if they reduce the costs, the price, but and the costs and then the price. But he says that they reduce the cost, but they raise the price because they have monopoly power. So little by little, Pareto is less and less convinced that these agreements are good for the consumer because they raise the prices. Again, here there is another quotation by Pantaleoni. Yes. I think I already, yes. Barone is a pioneer in this analysis. I would like to write something about him because he's a really pioneer in industrial organization. He shows rigorously, with the use of mathematics even, when mergers are profitable, the behavior of two firms with decreasing average costs. And he says, like in a game, the two firms has to decide if to fight or to make a coalition. He describes the behavior of a cartel toward the new firm that wants to enter. So it's very articulate and very interesting. I really would like to go into more deeper analysis. He also says that potential competition can be lazy and that market power may persist. That's interesting because Pantaleoni was totally convinced that market power is not a problem, while Barone, using tools similar to the game theory, arrived at the same conclusion, that market power may persist. Here you have, for the first time, a three consideration about De Vitti De Marco. De Vitti De Marco was more a public finance scholar. So for the part of the economic theory, he is less present, but he too belonged to the group of the Italian marginalist. And he too is confident that the power of a monopoly will not last. And he is very much in favor of free trade. He was a leader of the anti-protectionism movement in Italy, with the conviction that free trade would eliminate the privilege of firm with monopoly power. So how about this part of my research? yes, they followed the classical economists in dealing with entry and exit. In their years, there was the possibility to identify many more entry barriers. Mathematics helped them in dealing with cost functions that knew. This is the first generation, as Mary Morgan says in her article, to deal with a few large efficient firms. And so they described a new form of competition between large firms. And for all of them, the number of firms is not an indicator of monopoly power. But for Barone and Pareto, monopoly power may persist. So if they were strongly free market and free trade supporters, they recognize that the monopoly power in some cases may persist. While Pantaleoni and Barone, I cannot read, elaborated, yes, an economic theory of oligopoly in their two articles. I will skip this part. I tried to find application to special issues, to special questions, but I have no time to show this part. They applied, I have found similarities in their conception of dynamic competition or static competition when they dealt with gender issues, the labor market, socialism, and the Great War. So here is interesting because it is an intersection between economics and political science. But they used the economic reasoning to explain the social and political phenomena. So I skip this part and I go to my last part of the research. I have 10 minutes. I wanted to show that they used the concept of competition also in dealing with the concept of the state. In Italy, there was, among them, not for all, there was this conception that comes from Machiavelli of the governments, the conviction that politicians pursue their own interest. They are not there because they are benevolent, they are not there because they are ethical, but just because they have self-interested. And they all, the four of them, adopted the theory of the circulation of elites. That means you perfectly know the perpetual turnover of the dominant class. And I have tried to find out if their theory of the circulation of elite could be read with the categories of competition for political power. And I found that I succeeded because for them the turnover of dominant class was seen with the tools of competition. So the first formulation of the theory of the circulation of elites was by Gaetano Mosca in 1884. And then this formulation influenced very much De Viti De Marco. From this moment, I show in my research that this is a choral construction. So the dates of the publication of the contribution to this topic shows that they replied to each other and they built up the theory together. The first 4 years after Gaetano Mosca, De Viti De Marco built a model of the state in which there are two types of state organization, to limit ideal types, the monopolistic one, that is the absolute state, and the competitive state, which is the democratic state. This is a polar model. So there is the first attempt to model the state in terms of, in economic terms, because monopolistic and competitive comes from the economic, are economic terms. Then I will not, I mean, I go on because as you see, it's incremental this time, the knowledge, the process. So for Pantaleoni, the dominant class has the role to promote social dynamism based on competition. It's the role of the dominant class is to defend competition. Then Pareto commented to the draft of the previous statement by Pantaleoni, and he was skeptical. He was skeptical. He didn't believe that there is a class that can defend the common good in general. No, if competition is something good, you cannot be sure that that they will pursue this aim. No, every single time a minority has held power, its aim has been above all its own good. Okay. Then we have the base, I think, of the circulation of the elite theory, which is the law of distribution by Pareto. The income is distributed in a constant way in history. So there is always the top who is richer, and the rest who is the rest who is less rich and then poor. And Barone says this important sentence: the classes that hold the economic power also hold the political powers. So the rich are powerful. The most powerful are the richest, and they are the strongest. So in this quotation, there is the famous official description of the theory of the circulation of the elite. I think I have to run. Then I also examined their economic policy. They were all involved in policy. They were very activist. They were also deputy parliament in parliament. So their political struggle was a constant in their life. And their idea on regulation or in active government was against. Pantaleoni was definitely against. The market will regulate itself. And Pareto was skeptical, was cynical. Barone was in favor of an antitrust policy. And De Vitti De Marco, no. De Vitti De Marco, there is an interesting contribution on the competition in the case of a telephone industry. However, they were all against bureaucracy and other government failures. They are seen as the beginners of the public choice theory for this reason. So I'm going to finish in 2 minutes. My aim, one of my aims, was to demonstrate the way they were a group. They influenced and reacted to one another. I also have a theory of the way the construction of knowledge proceeds. So sometimes typically Pantaleoni started provocatively, Pareto framed the topic, Barone developed it formally, and De Vitti De Marco extended it to his field of public finance. In the last part of my research, I make a reconstruction of their ties with the rest of the world, of their contacts with other economists of that generation on these topics. And I show that there was a very strict network of contacts with the rest of the world. So, is there something on entry barriers before Bain? Yes, there is a lot. There is a lot of thinking on this notion. Entry is not considered only in analytical models, not in theory. I've told you a lot of theory that is not in analytical models, but in the theory that is not translated in analytical models, there is a lot about the sources of monopoly power. Economists of the past, my economists, were perfectly aware of all the situation between perfect competition and monopoly and the reason for that market structures also before the 30s. I stopped sharing the screen and I thank you. I was worried to be late, but I was not.
Thank you very much, Manuela. Timed to perfection, to the minute. Brilliant work. It's obviously a very, very deep, profound research project that the scope is, I certainly fully appreciate the extent of the scope that you've done. So well done. I've got some questions, but I'd like to go to my colleagues and friends online. Is there would anyone like to make a comment or raise a question with Manuela? Yep, Leandro.
Hi, Manuela, where did they, I mean, were they in the same institution, the same university? I mean, how they, were the same city, how they would, I mean, was just communicate with letters?
So the question is, where did they teach? Where did they live?
Yeah, I mean, how they collaborate, because they were collaborating, but I mean, they were in the same region in Italy?
No. Pareto was in Switzerland for most of the time. It was in Lausanne. Pantaleoni had a very a career full of problems because of his character. It was very so no, he changed many places in which he taught. De Viti De Marco was mainly in Rome, and Barone was the military. So Barone had not the career that he would have wanted to in the university. I have to say that about their personal ties, Pantaleoni and De Viti De Marco were together in the university when they were students in Rome, and they read Jevons by themselves, for themselves. Pantaleoni and Pareto were in there was a correspondence very intense between the two. They really went parallel their lives. I have here 4 volumes of the correspondence between Pareto and Pantaleoni. So they were very, very close. And Pareto gave sometimes some problem to Barone because he was so talented in translating problems into mathematical forms. And also there are some articles written by Pantaleoni, and then Barone made the second part of the same article. So their ties were really strict, but they didn't live in the same place. No, maybe they overlapped sometimes, but they were not in the same institution.
Just a comment on that. There's also the Giornali degli Economisti. You've got 2 of them as the editors, so they're regular in contact. You've got Pareto, who's not an editor, but he's contributing and writing letters to people. So there's this network, which is also beyond personal. It's this institution called the Giornali degli Economisti.
Yes, they started a new series of the Giornale degli Economisti. De Viti had it in his own house. And Pantaleoni and Pareto were in the team of the buyers of the Giornale dell'Economista at the beginning, and Barone collaborated a lot. And I want to specify that the Giornale Economisti was at the frontiers of economic research, theoretically, but still it was a militant instrument because they were very much, as I said, free market and free trade oriented. So the Giornale Economisti had, for example, had every issue had cronache politiche. The cronache means that there are comments on the political decision of the government. They were very critical with respect to the government.
Thanks. Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So Milena, I'm just wondering, so I think I feel you just want to simplify the story here and only tell the development of that theory from the purely theoretical speculation perspective and the strand. But I'm wondering, so whether back at the time in the 19th century, so the social and the political landscape in Italy shaped the idea of these four economics on their thinking about this monopoly theory. In the end, you talked about the state and Machiavelli's theory. I'm thinking so back at the time, so because I know so Italy has a long history of the city-states. That means the market there are quite fragmented and independent and probably quite separated. And does this have some impact on their thinking about this monopoly? And also a related question is, does the situation in Italy at the time make the thought of these four economics, Italian economics, different from the thought of the monopoly theory in other countries like UK? Yeah, that's my question.
So definitely the situation Italian situation shaped their thought for sure. As I said, they were very committed politically, and they were a member of parliaments, two of them, De Viti for 20 years, Pantaleoni for 4 years, and the other two tried a political career without succeeding. So absolutely, they were active. I mean that they discovered scandals, and they were at the origin of political actions. So they were really protagonists of this period from a political point of view. But on the other side, I can say that they were very cosmopolitan. So they were in contact with the rest of the world. When I studied the secondary literature by Mary Morgan, by Backhouse, Roger Backhouse, I have found so many similarities. I want to remind the fact that Edgeworth wrote an article on monopoly, exactly, and the first edition of this article was on the Italian Giornale degli Economisti. So he wrote, he published it in Italian before, because Italy at that moment was at the frontiers of economic research. So if the context influenced them, certainly influenced them, at the same time they were also influenced by the strong network they had with the other economists of their epoch. For example, the article on economic dynamics by Pantaleoni was discussed at the American Economic Association. There was a specific meeting in order to discuss Pantaleoni's article, and this is just one of the many ties that they had with other economists. Barone wrote 2 important reviews to Wicksell and Wicksteed at the end of the century. So I can say that it's true, that both things are true. Their theories was influenced by reality, Italian reality, and their theory was influenced by the theory of their international colleagues as well.
Ken, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I did. My question was a bit like Sean's, actually. Let me put it this way. What was the relative importance of monopoly versus competition in Italy at that stage, as seen by these four economists? Did they see monopoly everywhere when they looked out and wanted to work on it for that reason? So, and relatedly, were there attempts to measure it, to measure the extent to which monopoly was acting presumably adversely on the Italian economy at the time?
Well, there is a part of my research devoted to the reconstruction of the problem of monopoly in the wide sense in Italy. I have found a long list of contributions of Italian economists on the question of monopoly. There was not, certainly in Italy, there was not a problem of too big firms, too big business. They were, their concern was that the industries were too small, not too big. But at the same time, as there was an intervention by the government to protect industries, that was a problem in terms of monopoly power. For example, one of their political struggles was against the siderurgic, can you say in English, siderurgic industry that were protected by the state, and there was collusion between the entrepreneurs, the big groups and the politicians. So in Italy there was a lot. As I said, they also commented the antitrust policy of the US. So not necessarily the reality in Italy was stimulates their interest for the topic. There was a lot in Italy, but they also discussed the cartel in Germany or the antitrust policy. About the measure, if there is a way to measure the monopoly power, I have to say that it came later. It came later by a student of Pareto, who's called Luigi Amoroso, but it was later. It was one generation later, during fascism. Amoroso elaborated a sort of index to measure monopoly power. It was sort of Lerner index, similar. So there is another, it is another period, not in their period. But because they actually, most of them were not worried about the monopoly power, so they had not focused on the measure of it.
Mary Morgan.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Manuel. That was really nice to hear that wonderful, huge survey of all the ideas coming together and sorting themselves out. It was really great. And it made me think back to the stuff I'd done a long time ago now on this American case. And thank you very much for picking that out. And thinking about that American context, you know, and going back to Ken's question, you know, they didn't think monopoly power was necessarily a problem because it was a sign of efficiency and low prices. So, you know, this idea that it must necessarily be bad was sort of something which I think comes later. But thinking back again to my investigations of the American literature, there were made me think there are two things that are kind of missing in that literature, and I wonder whether they appear in the Italian. One is that there's almost no consideration in the American literature that I can remember about barriers to exit. So there's a lot of discussion about barriers to entry, but you know, part of what's the result is whether or not firms can easily exit. And I think that's, at least in my consciousness, something which only gets discussed much more recently. And the second thing I think, which from the kind of ordinary consumer perspective, which I don't think I found in the American literature, in the literature on monopoly, was why consumers might want to have monopolies or don't really care. I mean, if I go and fill up my car at the petrol pump, you know, we have an oligopoly in this country. There's 2 or 3 big firms. I don't think there's any difference between their products. It's all a question of price. But I don't have a way particularly of choosing on quality. On the other hand, if I think of some consumer goods, I don't want there to be 100 different chocolate bars. I actually want to have a much more restrictive choice because I don't want to have to think about all these different things. So there's an issue of consumer choice in here, which I think also didn't get connected. So I'm thinking here, for instance, of the American literature on controlling the prices of railway goods. And it's an assumption, it's a natural monopoly. You wouldn't build 2 railway tracks along the same space between the same 2 cities. And then my first visit to Japan, and I'm amazed to find there's 3 railway tracks going alongside each other, and they're competing on they're competing on speed and therefore price. So the consumer side in this, at least in the American literature, is really not filled in at all. And I'm just wondering whether the Italians were much better on either exit or the consumer side of this.
Mary, your article was so inspirational for me for this research, as you know. Barrier to exit. When they speak of mobility of factors of production, they consider entry and exit. So when they say that it is important that the inputs are free to be invested in different sectors, they consider exit. But if you mean, if they have the idea of sunk costs, no, I never met consideration of the problem. They say it takes time, but not a real calculation of the costs sunk in the old activity, no. And on the side of the consumers, yes, there are some consideration following also John Stuart Mill, for example. Habits are a reason for remaining with for buying commodities from a monopoly, or every kind of problem with demand elasticity was clear to them. The customers' loyalty is considered. The absence of substitute goods in that case is not a choice. In that case, you are obliged to buy. But there is a consideration of the inverse relation between the degree of monopoly power and the demand elasticity faced by the firm. It was in some cases it was clear to them. So there is a part devoted to the demand side.
Thank you, Manuela. I will continue, but I just would like to offer those who are on schedules, who've got time booked, that they should feel free to leave at this stage because it's now just gone 5:15, and so if you have another function, please go. But I'd like those who wish to remain, please remain, because the conversation is developing. So feel free to leave if you want, and then we will just keep going. So Leandro, do you have a question? Oh, it's a clap.
It was my fault. It was to just clap.
Okay.
It was very good. I thought it was to raise the rent.
Well done. Thank you. Can I perhaps raise an issue about monopoly power and government? It seems to me, this is a message that I've seen to have picked up from your work, but from others, is that it's, the classical view is that it'll, perhaps viewed through Ferrara of this idea of reproduction, where you actually have this way where innovation will be copied and you'll get to this new stable state. So monopoly is not a problem, but it is a problem with, statutory influence of privilege that results in monopoly power. Is that essentially how you see it? That's this 4 groups' major concern? It's not monopoly per se, but it's monopoly gifted from government, gifted from the state?
So at the beginning, I said that my research doesn't concern the legal obstacles to competition, because it was not problematic. If that was the main concern of the classical, no, we know. So I decided not to pay attention to that, even if when I studied the political part of their thought, the fact that they are so they are identified as the beginners of public choice is important, because they really believed that they paid consequences also at personal level for the fight for the struggle they started against the privileged group, especially Davitti De Marco, who was the leader of anti-protectionist movement in Italy, was convinced that free trade could make the power of these big groups that colluded with the state make this power disappear. So the reason why he fought so much for the free trade in Italy and anti-protectionist, it was because it saw it like a way to eliminate the collusion between big industrial groups and the power. So the problem of the government was at their attention every single moment. Of course, I didn't use it as a tool for explaining the market power. I was more interested in the barriers to entry of other kinds, but in a complete description of the concern of these economists, that's very, very important. Very important. It was important for them. Even when Pareto is in his period of being so skeptical, so detached from, also in that years of his life, he was so much involved in the Italian politics. They didn't lose any occasion to criticize the collusion, the privileged group, the interrelation between politicians and industrialists.
Good. Thanks, Manuela. I think we can draw it to an end if there's any, unless there's any other questions or comments. Well, Manuela, congratulations, a lovely presentation. I really enjoyed, well, firstly the topic and then the presentation. You're doing very deep research in this topic, and I admire what you're doing. So, and thank you for sharing it with us. We're also particularly fortunate that a large portion of what Manuela is dealing with is still not available in English. So we're getting an insight that we couldn't normally get access to. So many thanks, Manuela. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure for me to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Bye.
Goodbye. Bye. Thank you.
I'll just stay on for a sec, Manuela, to thank you when people go.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yep. See you, David.
Thanks, Manuela. See you.
Bye. Goodbye. Thank you.
See you, Rogério.
Bye, Manuela. Bye, Michael.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Hope to meet you in
Bye,
Padua in Italy next June.
You're going in
July.
June. Excellent.
Yeah.